The gym was already echoing with sneakers and laughter when Jason walked in. Nothing special, just a faded community center near the edge of town. Fluorescent lights flickered above scratched hardwood floors. Foldable chairs lined the walls. Foam mats had been laid out in the center, where a group of kids between ages 7 and 12 practiced how to stand, fall, and stay calm. Jason stood in the back, arms folded. He wasn't here to teach, he was here to watch. An old friend, Claire Hammond, had invited him to observe her final weekend session. She ran the whole program solo, taught kids how to breathe through fear, how to move without panicking, how to not look like prey. Jason respected it. Quiet work, necessary work. So he stood in the back, low profile, no introductions, just presence. It was halfway through the session when the energy in the room shifted. The gym doors banged open and a man entered like the place owed him oxygen. Tall, flashy, tight compression shirt, logo across the chest. Training shorts that looked like they'd never been sweated in. He carried a duffel bag he didn't need, slung over one shoulder like a trophy. His name was Bryce Cutter, Claire's guest for the final demo, someone the rec center had recommended to help with advanced instruction. Jason didn't blink when he saw him, but something inside him shifted, because he'd seen that walk before, the kind that didn't enter a room, it staked claim to it. Claire greeted him politely, clearly uncertain. The kids stopped practicing. Bryce clapped once, loud and sharp. Told the kids they'd seen the basics. Now it was time to see what real combat movement looked like. Claire tried to interject, said the point of the seminar was to de-escalate, not dominate. Bryce smiled, said a good defense starts with knowing what you can do to someone if you had to. He wasn't wrong, not completely, but it was the way he said it, like the mats were a stage, like the kids were fans, like the point was him. Jason stepped forward just a bit, enough to get a clearer view. Bryce pulled out 2 foam knives, asked for a volunteer. Every kid looked down. Except one. A boy, maybe 10, raised his hand, small for his age. Jason noticed the tremor in his wrist, but his eyes were steady. Bryce waved him forward, told him to attack any way he wanted. The kid stepped onto the mat, holding the fake blade the way he'd been shown, cautiously, elbows tight, afraid to go too far. Bryce grinned, let him swing once, then snatched the blade with a disarm that was way too fast and too rough for a demonstration. The boy fell, landed hard. There was no injury, but the air in the room went still. The other kids flinched. Claire stepped forward fast, checking on the boy. Bryce shrugged, said that was what real speed looked like, then turned to the room and announced, "This is why you don't let actors teach martial arts." Jason didn't react immediately, but something cold settled behind his eyes. Bryce continued, said that too many people today, people who have played fighters on screen, didn't understand what it meant to actually hurt someone with intent. He said kids needed to stop learning from old videos and learn from real competitors. Then he made the mistake. He gestured toward Jason, told the kids if they wanted to learn how to win a fight, they needed to stop listening to men who spent more time in trailers than training camps. A couple kids glanced toward Jason. Claire tensed. Jason stepped forward, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to reset the tone in the room. He didn't challenge, didn't raise his voice. He asked one simple thing, if Bryce would mind slowing down the next demo, or better yet, demonstrate with someone his own size. Bryce didn't hesitate, said that sounded perfect, smiled wide, then asked if Jason wanted to volunteer. Jason said nothing, but he stepped onto the mat. The gym went quiet. The children sat cross-legged now, back straight. Claire stood at the edge, arms folded. Jason and Bryce stood across from each other. No foam, no pads, just soft shoes and breath. Bryce bounced on his feet. Light. Loose. Jason just stood there, arms down. No guard. No posture, just still. The kind of still that doesn't come from inexperience, it comes from knowing exactly when to move. Have you ever watched someone call out the wrong person and not realize it until it was far too late? Tell us your story in the comments. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most prepared. Jason didn't move. Not when Bryce faked a lunge. Not when he bounced left, trying to bait a flinch. Not even when the kids leaned forward in anticipation, unsure if they were about to witness something violent or something unforgettable. He simply stood, feet grounded, arms relaxed, eyes calm. It wasn't passivity, it was preparation. Bryce didn't like it. He smirked at the silence, but underneath the grin was tension. He'd expected a backpedal, a defensive stance, something showy. What he got instead was stillness, the kind that says, "I've already fought this fight in my head. Now I'm just waiting for you to catch up." Bryce made the first move. Quick step in, light jab to test distance. Jason leaned an inch, the glove passed air. Bryce adjusted, tried a low-line sweep, fast, meant to trip or at least disrupt balance. Jason lifted his heel at the exact moment, just enough to miss the contact, then lowered it back like nothing had happened. The crowd didn't clap, didn't cheer, because they didn't even realize what they'd seen. Only Bryce knew, and it annoyed him. He pushed harder. Stepped in with a double jab cross combo. Jason shifted left. No parry, no block, just a lean that placed him out of range by a hand's width. Then he stepped inside, not to strike but to be too close. Bryce froze mid-rotation. Jason stood directly in front of him now, close enough to touch but not threatening. Bryce couldn't fire a kick, couldn't wind up a punch. Jason had taken his space and his options. The kid sat motionless. Even Claire, who had seen Jason train before, looked different now. This wasn't choreography. This was control. Bryce backed off, frustrated, said something under his breath, nothing loud enough to echo but loud enough for Jason to hear. Then he charged, aggressive this time. No more jabs, just power, step in elbow, twist for a hook. Follow-up side kick meant to drive Jason back. Jason didn't move far. He redirected the elbow with a shoulder angle, not blocking, just shifting weight. He stepped into the hook, ruining its rotation. And when the side kick came, he caught it one hand. Midair, perfect balance. Bryce stumbled, arms flailing slightly, shocked. Jason didn't throw him, didn't twist or counter, he just let go, and Bryce hit the mat, hard. The room was silent, no cheers, no taunts, just shock. Because Jason had just dismantled a trained martial artist without throwing a single strike. He offered Bryce a hand. Bryce ignored it. Jason didn't insist. He turned back to the class, said nothing, just stepped off the mat. One of the kids whispered, loud enough to be heard, "That was cooler than any movie." Another said, "He didn't even fight and he still won." Claire stepped forward, calling the group back into a circle. Jason stood in the corner now, arms crossed again, not smug, not angry, just present. Bryce sat at the edge of the mat, breathing hard, reality crashing into his ribs like a weight he wasn't prepared to carry. He wasn't injured, but he'd been unveiled. After the session, as the parents picked up their kids, Claire approached Jason, told him thank you, not for the takedown, for the restraint. She said most men would have swung. Jason shook his head, said swinging's easy, interrupting ego with control. That's the fight worth training for. Bryce stayed behind after everyone left, sat alone on the mat for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, he stood and walked over to Jason. Didn't posture, didn't explain. Just stood there for a while, trying to find the version of himself that made sense again. Jason told him something simple, that there's nothing wrong with being fast. But if speed replaces clarity, you'll always move one step ahead of your own self-awareness. And that's when the mistakes happen. Bryce nodded once, didn't speak, but his shoulders looked lighter. He walked out of the gym without making a sound. Jason didn't expect to see him again. Not at his cabin, not without warning. But there he was, Bryce Cutter, standing at the bottom of the gravel path with no gym bag, no bravado, and no one else around. Jason had been stacking wood. He paused when he saw the figure. Bryce didn't shout, didn't call out, he waited. Jason dropped the final log onto the pile, wiped his hands and started walking. When they finally stood a few feet apart, Bryce looked smaller, not physically but in spirit. He said he'd been wrong about the demo, wrong about the kid he knocked down, wrong about Jason. He said he used to think winning was about dominance, about taking space and never giving it back. But that day on the mat when Jason took everything from him without throwing a single strike, something cracked, not ego, identity. Jason didn't rush the conversation. He just stood there quiet, let the man speak. Bryce said he'd trained for 10 years, competed in dozens of tournaments, won more than he lost. But no one had ever shown him what it looked like when control didn't need to shout. He asked Jason if he could train with him, not in public. Not to brag, just to learn. Jason didn't answer right away. He stepped aside and motioned toward the clearing behind the cabin. A flat stretch of grass, old truck tires, weighted bags tied to trees. It wasn't a gym. It was a place where movement had to be honest. They walked in silence. Bryce didn't ask questions. Jason handed him a rucksack filled with sandbags, and told him to carry it 100 steps in every direction of the clearing, without resting, without counting out loud. He didn't explain why, just watched. It wasn't about the weight. It was about discipline in discomfort, about learning to move without broadcasting pain. When Bryce returned, Jason nodded once and told him to start shadowboxing. No mirror, no music, just earth and wind. They trained for hours, not hard, not fast, precise. Jason corrected nothing. Only repeated one phrase, "You're not here to be seen." By the end, Bryce wasn't sweating from effort, he was sweating from awareness. Because now, every time he lifted his arm too far, leaned too early, or blinked before committing to a shift, he noticed. That was the beginning. They kept this up for 4 days. No routines, just movements broken down until Bryce could no longer hide his habits behind speed. Then Jason finally said what Bryce didn't expect. He told him that power isn't what you hold. It's what you stop needing. On the 5th day, they stood at the edge of the tree line. Jason asked Bryce what he remembered most from their encounter in the rec center. Bryce said it wasn't the takedown. It was the moment Jason let him go, when Jason had him off balance, vulnerable, open, and chose not to strike. He said that moment haunted him more than any bruise could have. Jason nodded, said that moment was the one Bryce had never given anyone else. But now, he was ready to. Bryce left that afternoon, didn't take a photo, didn't post a story, just shook Jason's hand and disappeared into the dust. 3 weeks later, Jason got a letter folded, no envelope, delivered by hand to the gym where Claire worked. Inside it said, "I'm helping now, no more showing off. Next time someone steps onto the mat, I won't prove anything, I'll just protect it." Jason didn't smile. But his breathing changed, just a little. Have you ever had someone confront you, then come back, not for revenge, but for growth? Drop your story in the comments. Sometimes the people we clash with become the ones who carry our lessons forward. The call came just after dusk. Jason was repairing a hinge on the back gate when his phone lit up. Claire's name. No small talk, just urgency in her voice. She said Bryce was back at the rec center, not for class, not for teaching. He was facing someone, a man who'd walked in unannounced during the new self-defense intake. Not a student, not a parent, someone from Bryce's past. Jason didn't ask questions. He got in the truck and drove. The parking lot was nearly empty when he arrived. One old pickup, a handful of bikes locked to the fence. Inside, the gym lights were on low, not bright, just enough to cast long shadows across the floor. Jason walked in. What he saw stopped him for a second. Bryce stood at the center of the mat, breathing slow, shoulders square, alone. Across from him, a thick-set man in a sleeveless hoodie chewing on a toothpick, circling like a shark. Jason knew the type, the kind of fighter who trained not for balance but for impact. Claire stood off to the side, tense. The kids had all been cleared out earlier. Only 2 junior staff remained. Watching, frozen, Jason didn't step in, not yet. He watched Bryce. The big man barked something. Jason couldn't hear the words, didn't need to. It was the tone that mattered, dismissive, threatening, designed to provoke. Bryce didn't react. He held his frame, eyes forward. Jason noticed it immediately. No flinch, no twitch, no shift in breathing. The training had stayed with him. The man circled again. Through a feint, Bryce didn't chase it, didn't answer. Jason took one more step into the room. Claire noticed, said nothing. The man finally lunged. Not clean, not precise, just brute energy, a shove masked as a strike. Bryce sidestepped, angled off. Reset, didn't engage. The man cursed, tried again. Bryce blocked, redirected the pressure, then backed off. Still no hit, still no pride move. Jason exhaled, slow and low. Bryce was controlling the room now, not with fists, with restraint. The man finally cracked, rushed him with a 2-hand grab. Bryce pivoted, trapped the wrist, dropped to one knee and redirected the momentum into a low sweep. The man collapsed with a thud. Not hard, not injured, just stunned. He rolled onto his back, breathing heavy. Looked up at Bryce with the kind of stare only ego gives after being outclassed without damage. Bryce didn't smile, didn't posture. He simply stepped back and waited. Jason stepped forward now. Everyone turned to him. He walked across the mat and stood beside Bryce, said nothing. But the energy shifted again. Because even without words, the presence of both men, calm and grounded, shut everything down. The man stood, looked at both of them and walked out without speaking. Bryce exhaled. Claire approached slowly, told him he didn't need to stay any longer. But Bryce said he was fine. Said this was where he belonged now. Afterward, Jason and Bryce stood out back by the utility ramp. Jason asked one question, asked how he stayed so controlled. Bryce said he remembered what Jason told him weeks earlier. You're not here to be seen. He said tonight he realized that control isn't measured when you're outmatched. It's measured when you don't need to prove you're not. Jason nodded once, then said Bryce wasn't just training anymore. He was leading. Before leaving, Jason handed him a sealed note, the same one he wrote weeks earlier and kept in his coat pocket. Bryce didn't open it yet. He said he wanted to wait. Jason nodded, said the best lessons never land when expected. It was 3 weeks before Bryce opened the note. He kept it in the top drawer of his desk at the gym, next to the whiteboard markers and spare mouthguards. Something about it didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt like a door, one he wasn't ready to walk through just yet. But on a Tuesday afternoon, after the last kid left the mat and the lights dimmed, he sat alone and unfolded the paper. No advice, no quote, just an address, handwritten, rural, not digital, the kind you only found if someone wanted you to. And underneath it, a single line: when you're ready, go see him. Bryce drove 6 hours the next morning. He didn't call ahead, didn't text, just trusted that if Jason had written it down, the door would be open when it mattered. The road twisted through empty hills, past dry fences and wind-blasted signs. Eventually, he found a gravel drive with no mailbox, just a small gate tied with old rope and a dirt path barely wide enough for his truck. At the end of the trail was a cabin, small, still, and quiet in a way that didn't feel empty, just aware. Jason was outside when Bryce pulled up, not working, not waiting, just sitting on the porch steps, sipping tea like the day belonged to nobody. Bryce got out, didn't speak. Jason nodded toward the clearing behind the cabin, the same one Bryce had trained in weeks before. But this time, there was someone else waiting, a man, older than both of them, bald, square-shouldered, barefoot, standing on a worn canvas mat beneath a rusting wind chime. Jason said his name was Kenji, a man who had taught Jason the same way Jason taught Bryce, not with fists, with moments. Kenji didn't offer a handshake, he pointed to the mat. Bryce stepped forward. They didn't spar. They just moved mirror drills, balance drills, isolation exercises. Not fast, not hard, but exact. Bryce faltered, corrected, faltered again, recentered. And halfway through, he realized something. Kenji wasn't testing him. He was revealing him, the slouch in his left hip, the unconscious lean before each shift. The way his eyes darted before he truly committed to any strike. Everything Bryce thought was muscle memory was actually nervous memory. Jason watched from the porch, didn't speak, didn't interfere, because the moment wasn't his anymore. It was between Bryce and the ghosts he hadn't fought yet. After an hour, Kenji stopped, nodded once, told Bryce he wasn't finished, just ready to begin again, then walked off the mat and into the trees like a spirit vanishing into mist. Jason joined Bryce in the clearing. Told him that every fighter gets one moment where the mask of power falls off, and they get to choose whether they rebuild it or let it stay off. Bryce didn't answer. He just looked at his hands, same hands, but lighter now. They sat by the fire that night. Bryce asked Jason what Kenji taught him years ago, the moment that shifted it all. Jason stared into the flames, said that one day Kenji asked him how he'd fight if no one ever saw it, no crowd, no student, no victory, just the moment and the choice. Jason said he didn't answer that day. But he knew now. You fight to protect the space, not your name, not your pride, just the space between chaos and control. The next morning, Bryce left before sunrise, didn't take a photo, didn't grab a souvenir. He just left a note on the porch. I'm not showing off anymore. I'm just showing up. 3 months later, back at the rec center, a new session began. Younger kids this time. Shyer, a boy with a stutter, a girl who refused to make eye contact. Bryce didn't shout, didn't clap, he crouched. He listened. And when one of the new instructors asked where he learned his technique, he didn't mention Jason, or Kenji, or any name. He just pointed to the mat, said, here, watching, failing, getting back up. Final scene, outside the gym as the sun dipped low, Bryce stood alone in the parking lot. A car pulled up. Jason didn't step out, just lowered the window, nodded once. Bryce nodded back. No words, because the story didn't need more pages. It just needed to keep moving through the people who would walk the same path next. Has anyone ever taught you something that completely rewired how you show up in life? Not with noise, but with quiet discipline. Share it in the comments. The loudest lessons, often echo through silence.